if taking shots at each other is the way that we feel loved, I feel very loved by Rob Renfro right now, for sure. I will say that I don't have a really great track record of preaching on weekends that Alabama has big games, so I had low expectations for last night, and I told myself that the last time I preached, we got beat by the Aggies, and there's really not much more that could be worse than that, and I survived that, so whatever happened last night was going to be fine, and so I'm pleasantly surprised that today I think I might have broken my streak, and I am so glad that y'all are here as we are in the second week of Advent, and we are in a series called Searching for Christmas. So the Old Testament, it ends with a mysterious phrase in the last two verses of Malachi chapter 4, verses 5 and 6. It says, "See, I will send you the prophet Elijah before that great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children and the hearts of the children to their fathers, or else I will come and strike the land with a curse." And after the prophet Malachi penned these words, there were no more prophets and no more revelation for the next 400 years. God went silent. The end of the period between the end of the Old Testament and the arrival of the birth of Jesus in the New Testament is known as the 400 years of silence. You see, Israel was a nation with a long history of priests and prophets and kings. They had a constant connection to the voice of God and words from God, and all of a sudden there was nothing. There was no news of the promised Messiah, and so they waited, and they hoped, and they prayed, and they asked, and still God was silent. And generation after generation would pass away with still no word from God. And this 400 years, it was a time of great turmoil for the Jewish people. Conquering empires battled for their lands. First, they were conquered by Persia, then Alexander the Great. And towards the end of the period, they came under Roman rule. And the Romans, they were cruel and violent people. And any opposition from the Jewish people had been met with crushing massacre. And so it was a time of dark, desperate oppression. And the longer that God was silent, the more people began to believe that he had forgotten them. So atheists would tell us that God is silent because he's absent. And in series of seasons of suffering, when we can't hear God's voice, when we can't hear from him, we can be tempted to believe it. You know, God can use periods of silence in our life sometime to help reveal things to us, to help us see sin that we may be blind to. But other times, seasons of silence can be unknown. Things can feel uncertain as to why we're not hearing from God. And that can feel disorienting and painful and isolating and frustrating. And I think if you ask any of God's people if they're allowed to live long enough, they will tell you that there are seasons in your faith when you earnestly seek God, when you pray prayers needing an answer, when you desire to hear from him and it feels like you receive nothing. And I know seasons of silence in my life really well. I know what it's like to have unanswered prayers. I have a prayer that I have been praying for 20 years. And no amount of praying and begging and pleading and demanding and asking of God has seemed to make a difference. And I've had seasons of great suffering in my life, through loss and grief, through a health crisis, where it felt like God had abandoned me, that he had forgotten me, that in my pain, I couldn't hear him, I couldn't feel him, I couldn't find him. He felt distant. And if you follow Jesus long enough, you most likely will have a season where God feels far away and you can't see what he's doing. And that is exactly where the nation of Israel and a couple named Zechariah and Elizabeth found themselves when the Gospel of Luke tells us the story of the birth of Jesus. And what we're going to see today through the story of Zechariah is that even when God is silent, he is at work. The story picks up in Luke chapter 1, verse 5, and it tells us that in the time of Herod, the king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah who belonged to the priestly division of Abijah. His wife Elizabeth was also a descendant of Aaron, and both of them were righteous in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commands and decrees blamelessly. So Zechariah was a Levite, meaning that he came from the tribe of Levi. It's the same tribe that Moses came from. And it tells us that both he and Zechariah and Elizabeth both come from the line of Aaron, and that tells us they come from a long line of faith. And Zechariah and Elizabeth, they were devout people. They were faithful people that despite no new revelation, despite no words from God, that they followed God, that they were devoted to him, that they followed the commands in the scriptures, and they were righteous people. And it tells us this because it wants to give us the context to the next part of their story. It says that they are childless because Elizabeth was not able to conceive, and they were both very old. So despite being faithful, righteous, blameless people, they were not able to conceive a child. Elizabeth was barren. You see, childlessness and barrenness in this time, this would have come with great shame. This would have been a disgrace to their family. There would have been whispers because most often it was believed that infertility was a punishment for sin. And so I would imagine that as faithful, devout people, that Elizabeth and Zechariah had prayed the prayer asking for the blessing of a child over and over again. I am sure that they had begged and pleaded and cried and asked God to bless them. I'm sure that their friends, as they grew older, their friends all had children, and then they all had grandchildren. The longer that it went, the older that they got, their dream began to die because Elizabeth remained barren and God remained silent. Now, Zechariah, like all priests, except for the chief priest who lived in Jerusalem, lived in the countryside. And it was his duties to come into Jerusalem to the temple with his division to perform the routines. And so he would come into Jerusalem, and then he would go back into the countryside where he would be a local teacher. And it tells us of a time that once when Zechariah's division was on duty and he was serving as priest before God, he was chosen by lot, according to the custom of the priesthood, to go into the temple of the Lord and burn incense. So Zechariah goes to Jerusalem to perform his duties. Now, he would have been one of hundreds of priests who came to the temple. And in preparation for the big service on Saturday, they drew lots to choose one priest who would get the honor of taking in the incense and offering the prayer for the redemption of Israel and the coming of the Messiah. Now, casting lots, it's seen in the Old Testament. It's a bit of biblical gambling. The Greeks, it was also popular in their culture, and they believed that it was a way of circumventing human will because they left it up to the fate of the gods. So what Luke wants us to know here in this passage is that Zechariah being chosen as the priest to go into the holy place to offer these prayers, it was not by chance. God chose Zechariah in this moment in time to go into the holy place. Now, this would have been the culmination of Zechariah's priestly career because priests went their entire lifetime and never got chosen. And then once you were chosen and you had the opportunity to do it, that was it. Your name was taken out of the lottery. Your turn was over. And so I have no doubt that Zechariah had read the instruction manual. He knew everything he was supposed to do when he went in there for the big honor. I'm sure that he had listened to the priests who had been in there before, and he knew exactly what to expect when he came into the temple. So the altar of incense, it was located in the sanctuary itself, in the outer chamber of the holy place. So the holy place was the second most sacred part of the temple. And in the holy place, there was a doorway, curtained doorway, that led to the Holy of Holies, which was the most sacred place because that's where the presence of God resided. So by Zechariah coming into the holy place, he was coming closer to the presence of God than most priests would ever get. And certainly no non-priest would ever have the opportunity to do. So what happens is the worshipers of Israel would all gather around the temple and they would all pray together and the chosen priests would go in. And boy, is Zechariah about to be surprised and shocked by what he discovers. It says, then an angel of the Lord appeared to him, standing at the right side of the altar of the incense. And when Zechariah saw him, he was startled and he was gripped with fear. But the angel said to him, do not be afraid, Zechariah. Your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you are to call him John. And the angel appears on the right side of the altar and says, do not be afraid, Zechariah. Your prayer has been heard. God broke his 400 years of silence. But you see, Zechariah, he was just going about his normal routine. He came into Jerusalem to the temple to perform his duties like he had probably done dozens and dozens of times before. He was just being faithful to live out his daily routine day by day by day. There's a book in the Old Testament, the prophet Zechariah, who came years before this Zechariah. And he wrote, don't despise the day of small things. And it was in the small things, the routine of Zechariah's daily life, that God provided the context for something extraordinary. And I think it can be really hard sometimes not to despise the small things of our daily life. So for me, I feel like my daily routine can really just be a grind, day in and day out. I mean, we get up early, we get the kids ready, we go to work, they go to school, we pick them up, we do homework, we pay bills, we run errands, we make all the things to make life happen. We make dinner over and over again. I got married, I had kids. Nobody told me I was signing up to figure out what these people need to eat every single day of their lives, and they're hungry like clockwork every 24 hours, and most of the time, because I have twin boys, every few hours they're hungry, and apparently it's my job to figure this out day in and day out. It just feels like sometimes you just do what you got to do to get through the day and get through the next day and get through the next day and get through the next day. And I think despise might be a really strong word, but I definitely can resent the grind sometimes. I can get really frustrated and tired by it. And I can wish that maybe life was a little easier or my life was more grand. At the very least, I could wish that I had a personal chef. But what Zechariah's story shows us is there's nothing unimportant or small about the mundane daily routines of our life. Because it is in those small things of our daily life that God is working out his plan. And for the bigness of God, there is a remarkable love for the small things. Your daily routine, it matters. Your work that you do, it matters. Your school that you do, it matters. The way that you care for your family, the way that you provide support for your relationships and your friendships, those errands you run, those bills you pay, those things you do, all those dinners you make, they matter because it is in those small things that God is working in us and through us. And we never know when he is going to show up and do something extraordinary. And the angel tells Zechariah, he will be a joy and delight to you, and many will rejoice because of his birth. For he will be great in the sight of the Lord. He is never to take wine or other fermented drink, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit even before he is born. He will bring back many of the people of Israel to the Lord their God, and he will go on before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah to turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. God answers Israel's prayer for redemption and the Messiah, and he answers Zechariah's prayer for a child. I would imagine that there is no way that Zechariah thought that the answer to the prayers for the nation of Israel would be found in his personal prayer for a child. God was answering the big prayer and the small prayer. You see, God is big and he's running the universe and he's holding all of creation together, but he's still concerned about the human, personal needs of our hearts. Our prayers matter to him. And I don't know if you've ever thought this or if you ever felt this, if you've ever had like a prayer and you thought, well, maybe this is too small, or you had something you wanted to talk to God about, but then you were like, you know what, this is not that big of a deal on the whole scheme of things. And God, he's busy. He's very busy running this whole planet with like billions of people and try to hold things together. So this thing that I want to pray about, yeah, I probably shouldn't bother him with. But God's concerned about all of it. He's concerned about the big things in your life. He's concerned about the little things in your life. Those prayers that you hold in your heart for your jobs and your family and your relationships and your needs and your provision, your hopes, your dreams, your desires, your anxieties and your worries. He cares about all of it. And God's promised intervention on behalf of Zechariah and Elizabeth in response to their need turned out to also be divine intervention for the nation of Israel. You see, Zechariah and Elizabeth's barren wilderness of infertility and God's silence turned out to be the grounds for their breakthrough from God. Oswald Chambers, in My Utmost for His Highest devotional, says, when you cannot hear God, you will find that he has trusted you in the most intimate way possible, with absolute silence, not a silence of despair, but one of pleasure, because he saw that you could withstand a bigger revelation. And his son John, the son that would be born, he would grow into be John the Baptist. In the Old Testament, the Holy Spirit came upon people for different reasons in extraordinary ways, but John would be different. It says that John will be filled with the Spirit even before he is born, and he will be set apart, and people will know and see that the power that is in him comes from God. And John, he will fulfill the prophecy that Malachi penned 400 years before, that he will bring back the people of Israel to their Lord, their God, and he will go on before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah to turn the hearts of parents to their children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. John would prepare the way for the long-awaited Messiah. Now, this is a whole lot for Zechariah to take in, okay? He's old, we know this. And he's done this a lot of times, and this is not what he expected to happen. He expected to go in and have this beautiful honor moment where he gave the prayers, and then he came back out and he got shocked and surprised that there was an angel there. And so it's really no surprise that he has a very human response to finding out this request and this promise from Gabriel when he comes in. Zechariah responds and says, "How can I be sure of this? Because I am an old man, and my wife is well along in her years." He responds with disbelief, and he asks for a sign or a confirmation. And can you blame the guy? Because we believe that his wife was in her 80s. And I do love how delicate he is about her age. He says, "My wife is well along in her years, sir." That's a good man. That's a very good man. And Gabriel, he was not a big fan of the response and request for confirmation, because the angel said to him, "I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I have been sent to speak to you and to tell you this good news. And now you will be silent and you will not speak until the day this happens, because you did not believe my words, which will come true at their appointed time. Gabriel's like, dude, I don't know how much more sign you need. I'm an angel. A few minutes ago, I was in the presence of God, and he sent me here to tell you that we are answering a prayer that's been prayed for 400 years. I don't know how much more sign you need, so here's what's going to happen. Here's your sign. You're going to be silent for the next 9 months until what I've said has come true. And so Zechariah, for 9 months, is not able to speak. And there's a little bit of debate here with scholars, because later in the passage, people are trying to communicate with Zechariah and they're using signs. So it is believed that not only was he struck mute, but he was also struck deaf. Zechariah's sign was complete silence. And it says that meanwhile, the people were waiting for Zechariah and wondering, what's taking you so long in the temple? And when he came out, he could not speak to them, and they realized he'd seen a vision in the temple, for he kept making signs to them, but he remained unable to speak. And I just wonder what this means by he was making signs. Like, he comes out of the temple and he's like, what? You probably don't want to choose me for charades, but that's what I think it was, angel, baby. Yeah, okay, you get it. All right. When his time of service was completed, he returned home. And after this, his wife Elizabeth became pregnant and for 5 months remained in seclusion. And the Lord has done this for me, she said, and in these days he has shown favor and taken away my disgrace among the people. And when it was time for Elizabeth to have her baby, she gave birth to a son. And her neighbors and relatives heard that the Lord had shown her great mercy, and they shared her joy. And on the 8th day, they came to circumcise a child, and they were going to name him after his father, Zechariah. But his mother spoke up and said, no, he is to be called John. And they said to her, there is no one among your relatives who has this name. Let me tell you how I know this passage. I grew up in the South, like the deep South, like the part where we monogram everything. Bibs, burp cloths, towels, underwear, you name it, it gets monogrammed, okay? So when I was pregnant with my twins, my mom and my grandmother could not wait for me to decide on first names and middle names so they could get busy monogramming. My mom bought one of those big machines, with the big spools of thread on it, because we had a lot of work to do here. We had twins, and they needed a lot of monogramming to happen. So I finally settled on the name. And I called my mom, I told her the names, and then she apparently called my grandmother, so I get a call from my grandmother, and she says, we need to talk about these names. And I said, what about them? She's like, what kind of names are these? I've never heard these names before. And I said, well, we just really like them. She's like, nobody in our family's named this. I was like, yeah, I know they're not. She's like, no, we're going to need to talk about this, because let me tell you, your grandfather has a great name, and your uncle has a great name, and there's plenty of names in our family that you could use. I just get it. No one in your family has been named this. We stuck with my names. My children got to keep my names, but grandmother was never really happy about that. So then they made signs to the father to find out what he would like to name the child. And he asked for a writing tablet, and to everyone's astonishment, he said, his name is John. And immediately his mouth was opened and his tongue set free, and he began to speak, praising God. So when John was born, Zechariah obeyed God, and he named his son what he was told. And then with his newfound voice, the first thing he does is offer a song of praise and of prayer and of prophecy. His father Zechariah was filled with the Holy Spirit, and he prophesied, praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, because he has come to his people and redeemed them. He has raised up a horn of salvation for us in the house of his servant David, as he said through his holy prophets of long ago. Salvation from our enemies and from the hand of all who hate us, to show mercy to our ancestors, to remember his holy covenant, the oath he swore to our father Abraham to rescue us from the hands of our enemies, to enable us to serve him without fear, in holiness and righteousness before him in all our days. And you, my child, you will be called a prophet of the Most High. For you will go on before the Lord to prepare the way for him, to give his people the knowledge of salvation through the forgiveness of their sins because of the tender mercy of our God, by which the rising sun will come to us from heaven to shine on those living in darkness and the shadow of death, to guide our feet into the path of peace. In Zechariah's song, it wasn't a song just about his son and the answered prayer for him. It was a song about another son that would come, a son that would be born to a distant relative, the long-awaited Messiah. And it was a song of the future. It was a song of prophecy. It was a song of the plan of redemption. It's a song of divine revelation. You see those 9 months of silence, what could have been seen as a punishment for questioning or unbelief, it really was a preparation. Because in those 9 months, in the silence, God did something inside of Zechariah. He prepared him. And in that silence, he was able to reflect on the words of Gabriel and to receive divine revelation of what was to come. By listening and praying and spending that time with God, he immediately out of his heart burst into song for God. Isaac the Syrian, who is a 7th century saint, he said that speech is the organ of the present world. Silence is a mystery of the world to come. So I want to ask you a question. When was the last time that you experienced true silence? True silence before God? It's rare. Because we live in a world that is filled with noise. Our life often always has background noise. They say that we live in an epidemic of noise. There's a lot of studies about the effects on us mentally and physically by the fact that we constantly receive noise and words and messages, and we aren't meant to be stimulated that much. But more than the impact on the mental and physical, there is a greater impact on our soul, because it is very difficult to hear God and to hear his voice when you are constantly hearing words and messages and sounds of the world. Because human voices, they shout and they want to be the loudest, but God often whispers in the quiet. And his invitation in the silence is to come and be still and to be calm and to center in his presence before him, a place of peace in a world of chaos. So here's what I want you to do this week. To pay attention to your life. I want you to notice the noise around you and see how much silence you have. And if you have time, to just spend a few minutes in complete silence before God. You can read, you can pray, you can journal, you can talk, you can just listen and see how the quietness settles your soul before God. You see, the silence for Zechariah, it led to divine revelation. And the song that Zechariah sang, it's a song of faith, but it's the song of Christmas, a song that the Messiah would come, that a new day would dawn in heaven and a light would shine in the darkness, that we would be purchased from slavery, that we would be delivered from danger, that we would be set free and set on a path to peace. So I'm going to ask Rob and Matthew and the band to come out. We're going to celebrate Holy Communion together. If you have your packets, you can go ahead and take those out, but just hold on to them for a few minutes until Rob leads us in that portion. But the words that Malachi penned, the prophet, they were fulfilled through the birth of John and the birth of Jesus. God was at work in the silence. And he had a plan for the nation of Israel. And he had a plan for Zechariah and Elizabeth. And he has a plan for you and me.